Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of the Easy Conversations podcast, a podcast about having easy conversations. I'm your host, Furkan Dandia. If any of this material covered in the podcast resonates with you and you're looking for coaching services, I would love to hear from you. You can find me on Instagram at unoyazen or email me lifecoaching@unoyazen.com. But I'm really excited about this week's episode as I sit down with Dr. Mohamed Soliman. Dr. Soliman is a medical practitioner and life coach in the field of entrepreneurship. In this episode, Dr. Soliman and I discuss authenticity, vulnerability, and the concept of self. Dr. Soliman also discusses the common issues we encounter with language and the impact absolute terms can have. Absolute terms are terms such as always or never. Dr. Soliman and I discuss the importance of self-talk and being mindful of our language, leveraging our perceived weaknesses, and finding the balance of how we present our authentic selves. I really hope you enjoy this episode. You can find Dr. Soliman on Instagram at Dr. Soliman MD. And if you enjoy this episode, please leave a 5-star review. I would truly appreciate it. All right, Dr. Soliman, thank you for joining the Easy Conversation podcast. Really grateful for you taking the time today to come on here and have this conversation with me. Really excited about the topic or topics we're going to cover today. But before we get started, I just want to give you an opportunity to introduce yourself and talk about some of the work you do, and then we'll kind of get into our conversation from there.
Many thanks for the invitation, Furkan. Really a pleasure to be here. I would define myself as lifelong learner. I started my career as a pharmacist, then went to science, and then to medicine, and then a little bit of entrepreneur business. So it's, you could tell it's a lifelong journey of education. And it's a good thing to be in that mindset. I think education is the best investment we could do to ourselves and to our kids. On the side gig, I'm certified life coach, where my clients are usually professionals who are either moving vertically in organizations, so they want to know how to manage up, and people who want to change careers, but they are uncertain which direction to take, or they are certain about the direction, but they don't know how to pivot without losing much, which is the choice paradox that we have here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And you're obviously, so you're based in the US in Michigan, is that correct?
Yes, I was in the Big Apple for 6 years, and I'm done with New York. It's an inspiring and tiring, beautiful city, but it can get to you after some time.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And I guess on the life coach side, I think personally, for me, it was going through adversity and struggling, where I really wanted to kind of take that experience and help others. And I find that's quite common amongst people, where you have an experience that changes your life in a way, and then you want to give back and kind of serve in this world. What inspired you to take on the life coaching side, considering you were already in medicine?
Excellent point. And I think this also leads to a second question. What's the difference between being a psychiatrist and being a life coach? Because in psychiatry, you also help people. So to your original question, it is usually something that you will cultivate over years. I agree with you. Sometimes there is a life event that make people want to do it. For me, I think it was a natural thing to do since I was a teenager. Usually we'll have one or two people in their class that people will go to and vent their problems to or seek advice from. And it happened to be me and usually one or two other kids in the class. I don't know how and why. I think there are some personality traits that we collectively as humans grow up having, and could be partially genetic and partially what we inherited from parents or modeled after parents. When I started to formalize it is when I had some time to formalize it and get certification. The difference between which I get this question a lot, between psychiatry and life coaching. And psychiatry, you deal with the emotional aspect and the burden of life memories and life experiences and traumatic events. In coaching, no, it tends to be more specific, more about a snapshot of life. And you want to go from point A to point B, and you want someone to help you with this. I'll give you an example. If someone got emotional in a psychiatry interview, this is a window to get to know them.
Yeah.
In coaching, ideally, if you're following the International Coach Federation guidelines, you ideally would offer them time to reconstitute or even reschedule the meeting. You don't use this time to try to understand, oh, what is the childhood memories and things like that, because they are here for specific purpose that will be covered, say, in 4 to 6 weeks or 6 to 8 weeks. And it will not be most probably beneficial to what they are looking for. It doesn't mean there is no opportunity to explore emotions, but the goals need to be clear from the get-go. What is this coaching for?
Yeah, no, and I think like one of the ways I look at it is psychiatry or psychology is really helping the clients understand some of the past, whether it's traumatic events or emotions. And then coaching is really forward focused. It's like, okay, well, what goals are you going to set for yourself to, to become, get where you want to go? And so, I mean, I think both are very useful. And the fact that you kind of have a background in both, I think that's amazing. And I guess one of the things I wanted to touch on today, and the way we were able to connect was I came across an article you had published, and it was something I was really curious about. It was really this concept of a personal paradox. And the thing I was really interested in was the fact that there is this inability for people to really accept this paradox, because in some cases it doesn't align with this image or version of ourselves we have created or we want to create. And I guess, maybe just to give an example, and I'd like to hear your thoughts as well, but I think for me, if I'm trying to be a men's coach, anything that does not align with that, whether I'm not holding true to what I'm preaching, I'm going to try to hide that, or I'm going to feel shame or guilt for it. And that's where this concept comes in, at least from the way I interpret it. And, I think it is a huge issue, because just because we want to be a certain way or we're trying to achieve this image doesn't mean that it doesn't come with our own flaws. And again, just to throw it out to you and, see what your thoughts are.
Interesting point. And I think it's the paradox that most mentors, coaches, or any people in a position of giving advice struggle with, or not struggle with. Some people just have dual lives, but which usually fire back. So let's go first to what is authenticity. So philosophically speaking, it is a degree to which you or I is true to one's own personality, character, despite external pressures. So in that sense, you can think of authenticity in a good way, but also in a limited way. It is limited by our concept of who we are and the ideas for which the self holds true. So, and what is the self? That's another thing. It's a construct defined by beliefs, cultures, the book we read, the family values, the memories we had. And that was a big thought in David Hume's philosophy almost 200 years ago, where he defined the self as an illusion. Obviously, in psychiatry, that would be a heresy to say, because the concept of the self would be, if you look at it from Freudian perspective, the self is a construct. Having said that, Freud also said that we can't define ourselves except through the eyes of others. And the same with Paul Sartre, where when people misinterpret the term hell is others, they think it means hell, other people are, or people are evil. This is not what he meant. It is hell because we only interpret the self through the eyes of the others. And so that is why they are hellish. But that, if you look at it again, so if we said yourself is only your memory, does this mean when you lose your memory, you lose yourself? And that was one of the concepts of the self in the past. If we define the self in more narrow way, it can't really explain the human inconsistencies, paradoxes, contradictions, especially when we make decisions. And something happened that led to the term authenticity to emerge very strongly since 2009. If you look at the literature, at least in management, there is a surge in this thing, authenticity. And it's because you can guess, after the Great Recession, or great, I think it's not Great Recession, Great Recession, not Depression, people lost faith in big organizations. And this started the whole discussion about authenticity. We need authentic leaders. So now we talked about authenticity, we talked about the self. Does this mean then the authentic self that implies personal integrity is always good? And I would say, well, every virtue lies between vices of insufficiency and surplus. Too little of kindness is selfishness. Too much of it is self-martyrdom. Too little authenticity makes you fake. Too much of it can make you, I would say, self-focused or almost narcissistic. For example, if someone want to be so authentic that they only want to talk about what happened to them yesterday night or the argument they had with their parents the day before, and they are very authentic, they are very vulnerable, that is marvelous. But in a workplace, do you really want to have this consistently? Do you want to have this outside the work hours or within the work hours? And that where the balance need to be set. If someone stick to the self, but they are too loud or they are too blunt, is that really being authentic to the self, or that is being rigid and not wanting to adapt to a new reality? And this is where things that you start to hear, or we have been hearing this for a number of years now, bring your whole self to work. You have to be very cautious with these things. And some organizations are reverting back to the era before that, because if I'm comfortable in my pajamas, I the authentic me would say, what's the difference between me in pajamas or in white coat? I
Yeah.
can see my patients in anything. It doesn't matter. They are asking for professional advice.
Mm-hmm.
Would you really see a physician in pajamas? Most probably say there is something wrong. Yeah. This
Yeah.
guy, there is something off. Although I'm authentic, I'm really authentic here. Or if my authenticity, not to comb my hair, just let it as is
Mm-hmm.
and go and meet people. Um, is that really authentic? Or that's just lack of adaptability?
Mm.
And here where the authenticity paradox come in. If you're a leader and the company going through a tough transition, and you are a person who is a what you call them people person,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and then you start to show this an anxiety about the new direction, and people picked up on it. In normal circumstances, it might be beautiful and shows human vulnerability. On the other hand, when the ship is taking a new direction or sinking, it wouldn't be helpful because everyone around you is looking for strong leadership
Mm-hmm.
and tough decisions need to be made. So this is where I see it's not either or. It can be like any other virtue where you titrate it
Yeah.
and don't be insufficient, but also don't be in surplus.
Right. So I think what you've touched on with, and we see that quite, especially in these times, we're seeing that with a lot of constructs where the pendulum swings so far in the other direction that
Mhm.
now it becomes almost problematic. And when it comes to authenticity, I think, one of the things that you touched on, and I've, also experienced is the concept of oversharing.
Mhm.
And then when you kind of question that, people are like, well, no, I'm being my authentic self. And to your point, there is also potentially an issue with going to the other extreme of oversharing versus not sharing anything at all. And really, it's finding that balance. So when you talk about authenticity and uh, especially in the world we're in, I know you touched on it a little bit in the organizational aspect because of some of the changes we saw from like 2008 with the recession and all that. But in our personal lives as well, like as people that are in relationships with family, friends, significant others, there's also an issue there with authenticity, where people keep asking for it. We're like, oh, this person's not authentic. What are your thoughts on that when it comes to our personal lives?
When you say people accusing you of being not authentic, you mean the partner telling you not authentic, your kid
Yeah,
telling
I
you
think
you're
I
not?
think I think it applies in a lot of relationships, but I think mostly we see that a lot in between spouses too, right? Or
Mhm.
significant others, where you'll hear one partner saying, I want my partner to be authentic. And I
Mhm.
think there's an aspect of vulnerability, which we'll touch on here shortly, that comes in, but you almost have to be careful what you wish for, right?
Mhm. Exactly. And do they actually, this is a question I usually would ask when someone tells me this, and I would ask, did you ever ask them, what do they mean by be more authentic?
Mhm.
What would you hear mostly? Like people would say,
Well, I think in my experience,
yeah.
it's um, I like the way I perceive it is it's people are asking their partners to be transparent, be themselves. But
Mhm.
then I often find that even that when, say, if my partner, for example, is
Mhm.
like, I want you to be yourself, be transparent, but it's almost like they don't mean it. What they mean is like,
Mhm.
I want you to be yourself based on an image of you I want.
Yes. Mhm. And it can mean different things. It can mean I want you to share some of your, say, work life. And if you just share this with them, even if it has nothing to do with your personality, that will be sufficient. Or it means I want you to communicate more. That's what it needs to be clarified, because as I think Jacques Lacan is the one who said, language is our primary prison. Language really divides us. And if you look at what is the biggest punishment that God punished humanity with based on the biblical stories, does anything come to your mind? It is the Babel punishment, when human wanted to build a tower to see God, and then God punished them by dividing their tongue. And if you look at it philosophically, it is really the hardest thing ever. If you can't communicate, your life is about suffering. And that's what usually happens when people say authenticity. Do they mean really authenticity? Or they mean just sharing in general? You are too quiet? Or what do they really mean by this? So that would be my take on clarification.
Yeah, no, that's, I mean, I think that's an amazing point you made. I think communication is obviously key, and the lack of communication or even misinterpretation, which I think happens quite frequently, even in our day-to-day lives, where, you know, we just misunderstand what someone's saying, or that divide, like you said, in language creates so many issues. But I guess for this purposes, you know, I think we've touched on authenticity. You know, there's this aspect of vulnerability, and then, you know, the whole paradox. So being authentic, like you said, means that we are putting forward everything, whether it's including our flaws and our paradoxes. And in order to be truly vulnerable, you need to be able to put all that on the table. But why is it such a struggle for people in terms of being able to truly face their paradoxes, first of all, before they can even share them with others?
So you're touching on the point about facing oneself first. And I agree with you about this. Before we even share with others, we need to make sure that what we think is a problem is a problem. And if you get this feedback multiple times from outsiders, maybe there is some truth to what they say. And again, we go back to the Lacanian, Freudian way of defining the self, and even Sartre way of looking at it is we don't have a self that's separate from others. Although some people would say, or some philosophers would argue against that, there is something to be said about the value of feedback about things that we're not aware of. And these things will hit our awareness. Then we can decide whether to incorporate them and look at them seriously and see why this thing is happening. And then you decide. Some people would say, oh, I want to be authentic. I want to be angry. If the genuine you has the full right, obviously, say, to feel angry in injustice. But you don't need to express this anger at that moment in a way that might cost you your job. There is a way of pointing out things and discussing your emotions, but maybe at a different point of conversation, maybe later on. So the genuine you can choose the time, the tone, and the location to express emotions. Genuine doesn't mean either in close relationship or work relationship, things happen at the moment and just we blah.
Mm-hmm.
And it can be fake. And we know politicians, without mentioning names, but I think people can guess easily. One of the politicians over the past few years who was perceived as authentic, but it was lack of self-inhibition.
Mm-hmm.
It was absolutely, yeah, and it was perceived, oh, no, but he's so authentic, he just speaks his mind. No, not even he was speaking his mind.
Mm-hmm.
He managed to convey an image and say whatever he wants under this image and present it as authentic. So we need to be careful about this point and what we even consider authentic to ourselves. Why we do not want to face ourselves, because facing yourself is not for the faint-hearted.
Mm-hmm.
This is from the Far East, and it is really, as they also say, it's the pathway of the warrior.
Mm.
But there's a battle between oneself and oneself, whatever that self is.
Mm-hmm.
It is not a battle to do this and expose it to everyone else. In fact, if anything, I find this to be sometimes narcissistic, because in our battle, we have to involve our other people in our battle, and this shouldn't be the case. It is hard. I can see the paradox here, and this might be uneasy for some people to hear, but there is something to be said about that.
Mm-hmm.
If I keep trying to go this vulnerability process, and next day I go and dump this on someone just because he or she is a good friend, is that authenticity, or that just lack of awareness?
Mm.
And that's something to be, we need to think about carefully. Is it even justifying for behaviors that are not in line with our roles in life? For example, if you're a father and your authentic self feel like my kid need to be severely punished for this thing,
Mm-hmm.
your authentic self here doesn't have to act. If we agree this an authentic self, it can be, if anything, self-absorbed. We are convincing ourselves, oh, it's just who I am.
Mm-hmm.
And this is, it's almost a fixed mindset.
Mm. So I guess, based on what you're saying, if I were to like interpret it correctly, like there's, the authentic self does not mean that you act on everything that comes to you. Like there needs to be some, and you alluded to it, like just speaking your mind doesn't mean you're being authentic. And that's kind of as based on how we choose to react, we can't fall back on the whole notion that, hey, I'm acting this way because this is who I am and I'm being authentic. There needs to be some filters. And I think the way I look at it is just because I'm being authentic doesn't mean I should be hurting other people based on my actions and my words. That does not give me a free pass.
Yeah. And remember too, it goes the other way around. We tend to label people as untrue or fake as we perceive any deviation from the one authentic selves that we think of as they are not themselves. Does this mean there is no fakeness? No, there are. And you can take this sometimes easily, sometimes not so. But there is something to be said about certain environments and certain situations where acting, you can feel what you want, and your actions is not opposite, but it can be delayed to a different point in your career or your family life where you are more level-headed and can discuss things. When people, as you said, something really nice about when the spouse wants you to be more authentic, you are right. It could be just the way they perceive you, and they want you to fit this rule and fit this image. And if you don't fit it, then you're not authentic. The problem is you don't know what is this image and where it came from. Is it some fantasy that came from how they perceive a good husband or a good father? We have no idea. Sometimes we don't see things as they are. We see things as we are.
Yeah, no, for sure. And one of the things you touched on, and I just wanted to explore it a little bit further, was, obviously, when I think part of the problem where people often tend to get defensive is when we're given feedback. And I struggle with this too. Like often when I get feedback from friends or family, and if that feedback doesn't align with the person I'm trying to be, or that vision I have of myself, like for example, I consider myself very respectful and I try to be courteous. But if I get feedback tomorrow from a friend or even a spouse who's like, well, no, you were being selfish and you were being rude, my initial tendency would be to get defensive and shut down or just get upset with this person. But if I was really being authentic and accepting that feedback and understanding, okay, maybe I did behave in a way that came across as being disrespectful, but that doesn't change the fact that I still try to be very respectful with people. So there was something you mentioned about being narcissistic. Do you want to expand on that and how this whole notion of feedback, people get very edgy when it comes to
Yes. Just to clarify, when we say narcissistic as an adjective, it's not as narcissistic personality disorder or things like this, because now everyone is infatuated by what is narcissism. My ex is a narcissist, as if there is nothing to do with them at all. We live in an interesting time. So regarding the feedback, as you could imagine, feedback is the new F word. No one likes to get it, and no one likes to give it either. You will see this when you're in a more senior position in a company or in academia, and you are asked to give feedback. Most of the time, you don't feel comfortable. You don't want to hurt someone's feeling, or you don't care, or it will take time. But it's something that needs to be done in a different way. So if, when you said in your example, someone told you, you are rude, that is not a feedback, that is labeling. Because every feedback is situation. If that same person said, when you did this to me, I felt X, I felt insulted, I felt humiliated. That is very different from you are something, because it labels you as a character, as a person. It's almost as if it is for life.
Right. And that's when we get defensive because we're being attacked. Yeah.
Of course. And you have a right to feel so, and then you can clarify. So what do you mean by this? And then they most probably will talk about the situation or give you an example. But it goes both ways. When people give feedback, they need to be settled.
Mhm.
And this is where, again, the authentic self is not right. Because funny enough, the same person he gives you this straight shooter feedback, give them the same feedback. You will be shocked. They will
Yeah.
not tolerate it at all. In fact, people who have the strongest opinions about people are the ones who have the least tolerance to any criticism.
Mhm.
And this is a form of narcissism, the covert narcissist.
Mhm.
So guiding them, maybe it's also a good point to know something about yourself through how you came across to them, but they also have the responsibility to say, what is the situation, how they felt, and what made them feel so.
Mhm.
It is not your responsibility to read their mind.
Mhm. Yeah. Yeah. And so I guess when we start talking about the self, and a lot of the time, like I know you touched on Freud, but some of the more modern guys that came after Freud, like Maslow and Carl Rogers, like they talked about this whole concept of self-actualization, which when I think about it is more about, growing and getting to this version of ourselves that, people talk about what's your best self. And I think as soon as you start hearing self-actualization or best self, you almost struggle to think about, okay, like for me, how I interpret that is being your best self also means accepting your flaws and not using them as an excuse, but acknowledging that, okay, I have my own flaws. I make mistakes and I would like to learn from them and not repeat those mistakes. But that is also a form of self-actualization. And I think where people get lost is because I'm trying to get to this best self, that means there should be no flaws or there should be no paradoxes. And anything that does not align with that, I am going to try to hide or I'm going to struggle to accept. And yeah, I just want to get your thoughts and maybe touching even on, what you had written about that whole concept of personal paradox when it comes to this construct.
And to be clear, you are asking about when people face themselves
Yes.
and they now want to hide certain aspects from their, say, clients or spouses.
Or even themselves. Even themselves.
Yes. That is, and this is where having someone, myself included, you need someone, an outsider, to help you know what you do not know. In Johari's square, there is the part about the unknown unknowns. And this is the hardest part to know on our own. And it needs an outsider to tell us what we're really missing, because there is no one, like someone need to be extremely insightful and aware to know the unknowns, and I doubt they will be able to on their own. But once you get this, and again, that backs to the concept of the self is from the Alain Bourdieu theory that we only understand ourselves through reflections of the eyes of others. We need others to know ourselves. We can't live in isolation. We need someone, an outsider, who doesn't have also an agenda. And we can trust. And this can be hard, I admit, because you don't want to be so open to someone and then this get used against you. And so once you get to know this, you will work on it, at least one or two things, because otherwise it become too much of a battle. We can't fix everything. And this is where accepting certain things that I'm not saying you will be happy with it, but we can't keep trying to fix every single defect we have. We can capitalize on this defect, though, and make it a merit. For example, if someone suffers from an anxiety, not the pathological one, but say above average anxiety, and they try, and someone told them, you come across as an anxious person in the workplace, and that affects people's mood, focus, and overall the workflow. Then suppose they accept that part and they start to work on it. They can very much focus on how can I be less anxious, and or how can I present myself as less anxious, or they can use it to their strength, as in, well, if I'm an anxious person, it means I care. And if I care, that's something good. It's just I need to express it in a different way. And most of the things that we think of as negative, they have an upside to it. It just, we do not tend to think about the upside. And for some reason, we divide things as good or bad. There are clear goods, there are clear bads, but most of the things, as Shakespeare would say, nothing is good or bad, only the mind makes them so. If I can quote him, I think that's almost accurate, but not fully accurate. Not saying that there is nothing good or nothing bad. Again, I want to highlight this, but there is something to be said about weaknesses that have an upside. And we need to focus on that upside and how can we utilize it. I'll give you one of the examples from fashion history. I can't remember his name. I think Alan, he was in the 1950s. He was a fashion icon. His name will come to mind with, I think, as we speak. So basically, that gentleman, he was a gay, and back in the days, that was something that is very much different from what we see right now. And he was really awkward and very skinny, and he wouldn't be, if you think about how this person would be an icon in anything, it would have been almost impossible. So what he did, he capitalized on that. He dyed his hair in a way that is in line with his identity. He had these very skinny pants. His awkwardness in speech, and capitalized on that to become a fashion icon. So when he wrote, he talked a lot about soup. I know why. And then when the press come and ask him, oh, why do you talk about soup all the time? He would say, I don't know. I like soup. And then he stops. Very awkward. But you look how the press reacted. Oh, what does he mean by this? What does he mean by soup? Is that something? And he leave room for variable interpretation without him even intending to, or maybe he did. He just turned his weakness into a strength. And for some reason, we tend to get hung up on weakness only as weakness without looking at the upper side and how can we tone it down? Tone down an anxiety to be a friend. Turn down the loud voice. Someone suffers from just loud voice in general that can be annoying. And then they struggle with, well, but that's my authentic self. No, it can be a strength if you just tuned it down a bit without being soft voice. Because that's what happened, as you said, people go to the other extreme. No, it's how can I capitalize on that loud voice in certain situations, but in other situations, just not do it.
Yeah, no, I think I appreciate you sharing that and giving some real examples. So it's, obviously easier to understand. I think there's an aspect of vulnerability that we haven't touched on yet, but I'd like to, dive into a little bit. I think, and, myself included, I think when we are looking at our weaknesses and looking at, okay, well, how can we turn this into a strength? That requires vulnerability, but I think there's a fear, and this is just me speaking out of my own kind of perspective, but there's a fear of being labeled as something, right? So if I am going to be vulnerable and I'm going to accept that, I do get anxious, am I going to be known as that? Now, are my friends always going to consider me as an anxious person, or is my partner always going to consider me as an anxious person? And I think there's that fear of being our true authentic selves and accept facing the self, like you mentioned. We talk about be more vulnerable, especially men, be more vulnerable. But I think there is that fear that comes with it of, okay, I can be vulnerable, but what are the consequences of that? And am I ready to accept that?
And I think this something we might have touched about earlier is who are you vulnerable to begin with? Facing oneself is the first step. Because you can fake vulnerability.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely. You can fake authenticity by sharing, the fake humbleness. Anything can be like that. You can pick a story from your life where you suffered and how this affected you, just literally to gain customers and clients who identify with you. So sharing it in public is not equivalent to showing vulnerability. I want to highlight this, which might come across as odd to some people or new to others, but think about it for a second and maybe you would agree or disagree. It starts with facing oneself, and then we can care about what others say. And I agree with you about accepting. It's hard to accept that, well, I'm an anxious person, or I am impatient, or things like this. But there is a way also to reframe it. When we say I am something, it means this is who you are. Versus I act anxiously in stressful situations. This one can be improved. Because once you start, the label makes a difference.
Yes.
It really makes a difference. Because once you say, I am, say, schizophrenic, your identity and schizophrenia become the same. Versus I have schizophrenia, that's different. Means I have more to me than just schizophrenia. And so this makes the language used with the self, and this is where the self-compassion comes in. People might think self-compassion is an excuse. So I can do anything, and that's another paradox.
Yeah. Is
self-compassion a way to justify behavior? No, it is not. But it is if you don't even accept, you can coexist with part of the personality that you do not like and try to work on it. But at the same time, you know it is only part of you.
Mm-hmm.
It is not all of you. If you have anxious personality, this is one aspect, but you also have diligent personality, you have hardworking personality, you have many other good traits. But for some reason, the mind tend to focus on that one and define the whole self-construct through the lens of this one thing that we choose to focus on.
Mm. Yeah, no, and
How
I
does
think
this sound to you?
I think that's amazing, and I'm glad you touched on that, because I think the important part here is the self-talk we have with ourselves, and the power of words,
Of
right?
course.
And just saying
Language is a prison house.
exactly,
Yeah.
yeah, and I think it's amazing because I think there's that, and people talk about positive affirmations, but I think in this case, you know, when you're touching on the fact that just me calling myself anxious, I'm basically labeling myself and considering my whole self as anxious, whereas just saying I may have anxious tendencies in certain situations, and those are things that you can easily work on, right? And I think that's very powerful.
And without faking it. I mean, if you look at people just tend to overvalue certain negative traits they don't like, and it becomes self-perpetuating problem. They are not anxious all the time. They just say they have higher than normal anxiety when they give a public speech, or when they are in a new party, or when they are in a new job, versus others might be more smoothly transitioning. But once they pass this stage, their anxiety is still there, but not as it was, say, the first week. Once they start to identify with an anxiety, it has almost become part of them, and they stop feeling anxious, they actually miss it. They start to think, yeah, where's an anxiety? Why I don't feel anxious? It means I don't care anymore. And I'm sure you came across people like this who would tell you, oh, but I'm not anxious about the exam. Does this mean I don't care? It is almost what they think drove them to success. And it could be true, could be untrue. This identification and is really problematic.
So I guess what should one do then? Like, I guess, I mean, for me, like, again, I'll just use myself as an example. Like, I don't get as anxious with exams because I feel confident going into an exam. I feel prepared. That doesn't mean I don't care. It means I've done my work, but there's certain other life situations where I do get anxious.
Of course.
So,
and sometimes you ought to,
mhm,
because if you're not, an anxiety is there for a reason.
mhm,
It's not, people say an anxiety is when they think, oh, someone has an anxiety. Well, we all have an anxiety. It's not binary.
mhm.
It is a spectrum. And we need it through life. Otherwise, why would you save for the future?
Yeah,
Why would you invest for the future?
absolutely.
Why
Yeah.
would you have healthcare and life insurance plans? Because there is some uncertainty and anxiety about the future. So this is another thing about the authenticity. When we deny ourselves the privilege of feeling anxious, but at the same time, or our actions send something opposite about us.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. No. I think, yeah, and it's the whole concept of eustress as well, and like you said, anxiety, if looked at in a different light, there is positivity to it as well, as you've mentioned, and it's all about how we frame situations, and or we can also reframe certain situations, and it's how we speak to ourselves, most importantly, that we can easily misconstrue something and start labeling our own selves instead of even other people labeling us. And it's so important in terms of how we speak to ourselves, and being comfortable with certain aspects of our personality, knowing that it's just a part of our personality. It's not who we are as a whole. So, no, I think Dr. Soliman, I mean, we could sit here and chat for hours, but I really appreciate this conversation. I hope listeners get a good understanding of the whole construct of being authentic, being vulnerable, also being careful of how we not only speak to ourselves, but also others. And even when it comes to giving feedback, being very careful on how we choose our language.
And I'll end with something that you said, then what we can do, and the power of the language we use. Maybe some people heard about Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. It's in the 1920s, where they provide evidence that language directly affects our thoughts. And some linguistic scientists will argue against it, but there is some truth to how language we use deeply shapes also our experiences and understanding of life. And this is what's called, that work is linguistic relativism. It's even when we're asleep, our language is still running. Like once you say a label, the more your internal critical voice label you as a victim or label you as anxious, the more you will feel helpless. And it is tricky because now when you try to reframe the inner voice, it can be too late and it can sound fake. That's why affirmation, it doesn't work for everyone. Some people even find it fake, and I totally see this because they would say, well, I feel it is not me. And it's not, and they think it's a problem in them. It's not a problem in them. Like you are at a stage. Some people catch these thoughts very early, so they can listen to these things and change them. Some people have been with these thoughts for life. And so then they change the dialogue in a different way. They might need to write it down. If you don't feel like writing, which most people would say these days, we all have mobile phones. Try to record it and record it without editing. This is back to an important point that you're asking about, is facing the self and the vulnerability. If you are truly walking the walk, one should be able to record his or her own voice, listen to it, and see, or not see, this time will be here, what is the inner dialogue without thinking, just ramble, no complete sentences. If you have a fight with someone, just ramble your thoughts after this fight, and as if you are venting to the phone, and then listen to it. You will be surprised. I mean, you're a podcaster, I'm a podcaster, and we both know when we listen to our podcast before we release it, and we're in the editing phase, you sometimes say, why did I say this twice? Yeah, or you say, oh, that's embarrassing. Why did I ask this question this way? I could have asked in a better way. And you don't say, I am a fool. You say, this is embarrassing. That is big difference. And that's part of facing oneself. As long as it's expressed somehow, writing, voice, record yourself, video, whatever it is, and then see what your inner dialogue is saying. And you will be surprised. And especially if you're a super achiever. Especially if you're a super achiever. This is the category I work with. And because you get by with your intelligence, it doesn't mean that the inner dialogue is correct.
Mhm. Yeah. No, that resonates for me. I think myself included, I am pretty hard on myself, and I wouldn't say this is embarrassing. I would say something very negative about myself, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because the power of words is so important, because the way we speak to ourselves, if we were to speak that way to our friends or our children, we'd be just mortified.
Oh yeah, it is. It is mortifying. And it's a bunch, again, back to David Hume, where we started. What is the self? Is a
Mhm.
bunch of memories, reflections, opinions, upbringings, books. We tend to forget books.
Mhm.
People are influenced by, and you put all of them in a box. And these things are not fixed. They go out of the box and new things come in. Sometimes this box is replaced by a new one.
Mhm.
And it's not, although it can feel to some people it's not authentic to change few things, look at it as I am doing good, but I can be better.
Mhm.
So in one aspect, you're acknowledging that there are good things to you, there are not so good things to you, and there is room for improvement.
Mhm.
Instead of I am not good, I need to be better.
Mhm.
That is this not makes a big difference, because that will be driven by an anxiety. The former will be driven by self-development.
No, that's amazing, and that's a great way to end. Thank you again, Dr. Soliman. I really appreciate you coming on here and having this conversation with me. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and I'm hoping we can have more of these. But I guess for listeners that want to find you or reach out to you, what are some of the ways they can, get a hold of you, whether it's social media or online platforms? What are some of the best ways to find you out there?
Thank you for inviting me first. It was really enjoyable, and I hope it would be of insight to some of your listeners. My website is dr, like doctor, my last name Soliman, one word. So DrSoliman.com. And all my social media is handle Dr. Soliman MD, MD like medical doctor. That will be mostly Instagram, LinkedIn. I'm on TikTok too, but still not really engaged in that. I think it's more for, I think it's a platform more for entertainment.
Yeah.
Yes. And on Facebook, although less so. So mostly Instagram and LinkedIn.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. Yeah, if people want to get a hold of Dr. Soliman, find him online. Thank you again. And I look forward to chatting with you again.
Appreciated. Thank you for coming, and hopefully we'll have a chance to talk in more episodes.
Absolutely.
Thank you for tuning in to another episode. As always, please subscribe to the podcast if you enjoy the episodes, or leave a comment in the comment section. I always love hearing from you. Thank you again, and until next week.